It began in the spring of 1971, the nation's capital. A city struggling under the weight of poverty, racial tensions and mistrust in its own institutions. Washington D.C. was a place divided. Politicians on one side of the river, and on the other, communities left to fend for themselves. And then, something darker arrived. One by one, young black girls began to vanish from the neighborhoods around Anacostia and Prince George's County in Maryland. Children who should have been walking to the corner shop or heading home from a friend's house, disappearing into thin air. At first, police treated them as runaways, but soon, bodies started turning up, discarded along the freeways that cut through the edges of the city. The killer would come to be known as the Freeway Phantom, a name whispered through classrooms and across kitchen tables while parents kept their daughters close and curfews grew earlier with each passing week. For 16 months, he terrorized Washington, preying on some of its most vulnerable children, before simply vanishing as suddenly as he'd appeared. No one was ever charged, no one ever confessed. And half a century later, the case remains one of America's most haunting unsolved serial killings. This is the story of the Freeway Phantom, a killer who hunted the highways of Washington, D.C. and the city that never stopped looking over its shoulder. My name's Jack Lawrence. Welcome to Crime at Bedtime. Before we head back to 1971 and the story of the Freeway Phantom, it's time to take a minute. Time to relax and focus on our breathing. As always, utilizing the 4-6-8 method, we'll breathe in slow and deep through the nose for 4 seconds, holding the breath for 6, and then breathing out slow and controlled for 8. Here we go. Breathing in for 4. Hold. And slowly and controlled back out. And again, slowly breathing in deep, filling the lungs for 4. Holding. And slowly and controlled back out again. One more time, breathing in deep, slow, through the nose, filling the lungs for 4 seconds. Holding for 6. And slowly and controlled back out again. Now, as you breathe normally, let's head back to the story of the Freeway Phantom, Washington, D.C., 1971. In the spring of 1971, Washington, D.C. was a city caught between progress and pain. It was just a few years after the riots that followed Dr. Martin Luther King Jr.'s assassination, and scars still ran deep through the capital. Neighborhoods east of the Anacostia River, once tight-knit and bustling, were struggling. Shops had closed, unemployment was high, and the streets felt forgotten. To many families, it seemed the city on the hill had turned its back. And when children disappeared from those same neighborhoods, no one seemed to listen. In those days, the southeast side of Washington was a world apart from the marble buildings downtown. There were no tourists here, only families doing their best to get by and survive. The freeways that ran through the city were new then. Long stretches of concrete meant to connect Washington to Maryland and Virginia. They carved through communities, cutting off blocks, separating neighbors, creating pockets of isolation. At night, the hum of traffic was constant. Headlights flickered across overpasses and empty fields. And before long, those highways would become the dumping grounds for a killer. The first to disappear was Carol Denise Spinks. She was just merely 13 years old, shy, polite, with a soft smile and a love for helping her mother around the house. The Spinks family lived in a modest apartment in Congress Heights, one of the southeast neighborhoods hit hardest by poverty in the years following the riots. Carol was one of 7 children, the kind of middle child who never caused trouble and was fiercely protective of her younger siblings. She was in 7th grade, a good student who loved animals and dreamed of becoming a nurse. Her mother worked long hours and ran a tight home, determined to keep her children safe in a neighborhood that could be unpredictable. On the afternoon of April 25, 1971, Carol's mother asked her to stay home and look after her youngest sister while she ran some errands. But Carol's older sister, Valerie, had another idea. She convinced Carol to walk down to a 7-Eleven store less than half a mile away to buy some snacks. It was broad daylight and a short walk, less than 10 minutes each way. Carol wore blue shorts, white tennis shoes, and a neatly pressed blouse. She grabbed a few dollars and told her sister she'd be right back. When their mother returned home about an hour later, Carol wasn't there. Valerie admitted she'd let her go to the store, but assumed she would be back any minute. However, by nightfall, panic had started to set in. The Spinks family searched the neighborhood, calling Carol's name up and down the street. They checked the store, asked neighbors, even went to the police station. But officers initially told them just to wait. It wasn't unusual, they said, for young girls to stay out late or run off for the night. They'd come home. They almost always did. Except Carol didn't. In the weeks that followed, the Spinks family plastered missing posters around the neighborhood. They called every hospital and youth home they could find. But the days turned into weeks, and there was nothing. The case received little attention in the press. A young black girl missing from a poor neighborhood didn't make front-page headlines in 1971. But in that quiet gap between police indifference and family desperation, someone else was watching. Someone who would soon strike again. Just 3 months later, on July 27th of 1971, another young girl disappears. Brenda Faye Crockett, just 10 years old. Brenda was from the northwest side of the city, near 14th Street. Unlike Carol, she lived in a busier, more central neighborhood, but her family knew the same struggles. Her mother worked evenings, leaving Brenda and her siblings in the care of neighbors until she got home. She was an outgoing, sweet-natured child who loved to dance and often sang around the house. She was small for her age, wore her hair in neat plaits, and adored her dog, a little mutt named Lucky. On that July evening, Brenda had been sent out to pick up something from the corner shop, just like Carol. And just like Carol, she never came back. By 9:30 that night, her mother returned home to find Brenda missing. The family began calling friends and neighbors, hoping she'd gone to play somewhere nearby. And then the phone rang. A neighbor answered it first. It was Brenda. Her voice was quiet, nervous. She said a man had taken her, but that she was fine. She told the neighbor not to worry, and that she would be home soon. Moments later, the phone rang again. This time, Brenda's mother picked it up, and Brenda repeated the same words, that a man had taken her, but he was going to let her go soon. Her mother asked her where she was. She hesitated. Then she said, "He says I'm in Virginia." Those were the last words anyone in the Crockett family ever heard from her again. The phone call made headlines, but it didn't lead to answers. It only deepened the unease spreading through D.C. Parents kept their children close. Curfews began getting stricter, and girls walked to school in pairs. 2 young lives, both taken from ordinary neighborhoods, both vanishing on errands that should have been safe. In the space of just 3 months, 2 families were utterly destroyed, and most of Washington still hadn't even realized what was coming. Because the man who had taken Carol and Brenda wasn't finished. In fact, he was only just beginning. For 6 long days after Carol Dennis Spinks disappeared, her family searched the streets of Congress Heights. Her mother refused to sleep, her siblings went door to door, and neighbours combed the fields near the Baltimore-Washington Parkway. Then, on May 1st of 1971, a man walking along an embankment near the highway spotted something in the grass. At first, he thought it was just some discarded clothing. But it wasn't. Carol's body was found less than a mile from her home. She was still wearing the same blouse and tennis shoes that she'd left in. Her small frame had been hidden in the weeds, just feet from the road where cars sped by day and night. Whoever left her there had chosen the spot carefully, close enough for a quick stop, far enough that no one could see. The medical examiner's report later confirmed what her family already feared. Carol had been assaulted and then strangled. Her body showed signs of having been kept somewhere else before being dumped. The discovery shattered the community. Parents no longer let their children play outside, and girls began walking in pairs even in daylight. But police told the public little. The case, they said, was under investigation. 10-year-old Brenda Faye Crockett, whose frightened phone calls had given her family brief hope, would be found the morning after she disappeared. Her body lay on a grassy verge beside US Route 50 in Prince George's County, Maryland. Like Carol, she had been assaulted and strangled. A scarf was tied around her neck. Investigators noted the similarities: the age of the victims, the method, and the dump sites near busy highways. But officially, the cases weren't yet linked. For the families, there was no need for official confirmation. They already knew something terrible was happening to their daughters. Next to vanish was Darlenia Johnson, 16 years old, last seen on July 8th of 1971 walking toward her job at a recreation centre in the Congress Heights area. She never made it. Nearly 2 weeks later, on July 19th, her body was found in thick brush beside the same Baltimore-Washington Parkway where Carol Spinks had been discovered. Darlena's remains were badly decomposed from summer heat, making it impossible to determine some forensic details. But the pattern was already clear: abduction, assault, strangulation, and roadside disposal. By now, 3 young black girls from Washington D.C. had been found dead within just a few miles of one another. And the city was in panic. It happened again, only days later. On October 1st, 1971, Nina Mashir Yates, just 12, left her apartment in northeast D.C. to run an errand to a nearby Safeway store. She never made it home. Less than 2 hours later, the shortest window yet, her body was found by a road worker just off the Baltimore-Washington Parkway. Again, strangled. This time, the killer hadn't even waited until nightfall. The boldness of the act stunned everybody. The idea that someone could snatch a child in broad daylight and leave her body on a major route unseen made it clear. Whoever was doing this was operating with frightening confidence. Police finally admitted publicly that the murders were likely connected, and the press soon gave the killer a name: the Freeway Phantom. From that moment, the atmosphere in Washington shifted. Parents escorted children to school. Newspapers printed warnings urging vigilance. Nightly news broadcasts reminded viewers that the killer was still out there somewhere. Women and girls reported being followed by cars. Every rumor felt credible. The Phantom could be Anyone, anywhere. A neighbour, taxi driver, a delivery man. But after Nena Mashia Yates, the killings suddenly stopped. For nearly a year, there was nothing. Until in November 1972, the Phantom returns. 18-year-old Brenda Denise Woodard was older than the previous victims, a high school senior. She worked part-time at a restaurant and attended night classes. On the 15th of November 1972, she spent the evening with friends, then boarded a bus toward her home in Maryland. But she never arrived. 6 hours later, her body was discovered along an embankment on Route 202 near the Baltimore-Washington Parkway. This time, she'd been stabbed multiple times and strangled with her own scarf. Her coat was folded neatly across her chest. But this time, the killer left something behind. Inside Brenda's coat pocket, investigators found a handwritten note, which read, "This is tantamount to my insensitivity to people, especially women. I will admit the others when you catch me, if you can." The signature was chillingly simple. Freeway Phantom. The press printed the letter in full, and panic turned to hysteria. No longer was the killer a shadow. He had a voice. The final known victim was Diane Williams, 17 years old, found along the Interstate 295 ramp. She'd been strangled with the belt from her school uniform. Her death bookended a 16-month spree that left 6 girls dead and an entire city terrified. Diane had been on her way home from visiting her boyfriend when she vanished. Like those before her, she never came back. Her body discovered just minutes from where Carol Spinks had first been found the year before. A grim circle, closing where it began. By the time Diana Williams was buried, Washington D.C. was paralyzed by fear. 6 victims, aged between 10 and 18. All African-American girls, all abducted from familiar streets, all left beside the freeways that cut through the city like open wounds. Of course, the pattern was undeniable. The name Freeway Phantom stuck, first coined by a local journalist and soon echoed across every front page. But while the city held its breath, the killer disappeared, again, into the noise of traffic and time. By the autumn of 1972, 6 young girls had been murdered, their bodies found, but yet, still no suspects. Public pressure was mounting. The media hounded police for answers. Families accused investigators of neglect, claiming that if the victims had been white, the killer would already be caught. Under growing criticism, local and federal agencies joined forces to form one of the largest multi-jurisdictional task forces in DC history. They called it Operation Freeway Phantom. The task force brought together officers from the Metropolitan Police Department, Prince George's County Police, and the FBI. Lieutenant David Akers took command of the operation, coordinating between departments. The first order of business was to look for common threads, geographic patterns, forensic evidence, or behavioral traits. At that time, modern profiling didn't exist. Forensics were very limited to fibers, fingerprints, and the occasional hair sample. DNA testing was still years away. Still, detectives managed to find something unusual. Several of the victims' clothing contained green synthetic fibers, possibly from a carpet or car upholstery. It was one of the few physical clues linking the murders. They also discovered that at least 2 victims appeared to have been kept alive for a few days before being killed, suggesting the killer had access to a private location, possibly a home or a vehicle. Then there was the note, of course, the handwritten note found in Brenda Denise Woodard's coat pocket. It became the task force's central focus. The phrasing, "tantamount to my insensitivity," struck investigators as oddly formal. FBI agents suggested the author might have been educated, perhaps someone who read a lot or had some familiarity with legal or academic writing. Linguistic experts even noted that tantamount was a word rarely used by the general public, possibly hinting at the killer's age or background. Despite their efforts, though, the note yielded no fingerprints and no conclusive match to any handwriting. It was the Phantom's only communication, a single haunting sentence that mocked police for their failures. As detectives reviewed violent crime cases from nearby counties, one group of offenders stood out. A gang known as the Green Vega Rapists. They were a crew of men in their 20s who committed a string of brutal sexual assaults across D.C. and Maryland in the early 1970s, often abducting their victims from the street. Several members were already in prison by the time the Freeway Phantom killings ended. In interviews, one inmate told investigators that another member had bragged about involvement in the murders, claiming to have taken girls from D.C. and left them on the freeway. For months, detectives pursued the lead. They brought in multiple suspects for polygraph tests, including men already serving time for other crimes. But each claim eventually fell apart. Some confessions contradicted known facts, others were likely attempts to gain attention or leniency. By the end of 1974, the Green Vega theory had collapsed. Another dead end in a trail that seemed to lead nowhere. Several individual suspects were also considered over the years. One was Edward Sullivan, a former D.C. police officer, and his friend Tommy Simmons, a special police officer, part of a private security outfit. They'd been charged with the abduction and rape of a young woman in 1971, a case bearing eerie similarities to the Phantom's pattern. The women had been forced into a car and attacked before being released near a freeway. Police searched the pair's vehicles and homes for evidence that would tie them to the murders. However, nothing conclusive was found. Both men denied any connection to the killings, and charges related to the Freeway Phantom were never filed. Despite the lack of proof, many detectives privately believe that Sullivan and Simons fit the profile. Law enforcement experience, access to police radios, knowledge of local jurisdictions, and a shared sexual sadism. Still, without hard evidence, the case stalls once again. FBI profilers reviewing the case in the late 1970s described the killer as organized and confident, someone who blended easily into his surroundings. He seemed to know how to avoid detection, suggesting either prior criminal experience or a methodical personality. He likely had a vehicle with privacy, possibly a van or a station wagon, and a secluded location to hold his victims before disposal. The boldness of the crimes also suggested familiarity with the area. Each body was left along well-travelled routes, often close to exits or ramps. This man knew the terrain. The killer's taunting note, meanwhile, implied a degree of narcissism, the need for recognition without risking capture. Even decades later, analysts would note how rare it was for a serial offender to write just once and never again. It was almost as if he wanted to prove he could control the narrative with one single line. By the mid-1970s, Operation Freeway Phantom had logged more than 26,000 man-hours and interviewed over 1,000 people. But the trail had gone cold. Leads had dried up, public attention had faded, and new crimes pushed the case down the list of priorities. Detective Homer Campbell, one of the original investigators, later described the experience as chasing smoke on the highway. Files were boxed up, stored in archives, and left to gather dust. The Phantom, whoever he was that. A phantom. And he'd simply vanished. The murders ended as abruptly as they began, leaving behind 6 grieving families and a city haunted by the shadow of the unknown. When the last of the Freeway Phantom files was boxed up in the late 1970s, most people assumed the case would stay buried. The city had moved on, crime was rising in other areas, and D.C. had earned a grim new nickname, the murder capital of America. But for the families of the 6 young girls, there was no moving on. They still waited for a name, for a face, for anything that explained why their daughters were taken. By the 1980s, many detectives who had worked the case had retired or died. The files, thousands of pages of interviews, photographs and crime scene reports, sat in the Metropolitan Police Department archives untouched. Occasionally, a young officer or journalist would stumble across the story, but few followed it up. It was too cold, too old, and too painful. For the mothers who were still alive, the silence hurt almost as much as the loss itself. One of them, Mary Spinks, Carol's sister, later told a reporter, "They forgot about our girls. They just stopped caring. And in many ways, she was right. The victims were poor and black. Their neighbourhoods were neglected, and the case was old enough that it no longer served anyone's political purpose. In the early 2000s, a new wave of detectives joined the D.C. Homicide Division. Among them were officers who had grown up hearing whispers of the Freeway Phantom. In 2006, veteran investigators reopened the case. They pulled the original evidence boxes from storage, clothing, photos, fibre samples, and began sorting through them. Some materials were degraded beyond use, but others were surprisingly well preserved. Fibres, hairs, even minute biological traces were submitted for DNA testing, technology that hadn't existed when the murders first happened. And for the first time in decades, there was a sense of hope. The results, however, were mixed. A few profiles were developed, but none matched anyone in the national database. It was progress, but it didn't bring them closer to a suspect. Still, detectives refused to give up. One of them, Sergeant Homer Campbell, said, "We don't close these things, we just wait for science to catch up." In the years that followed, the case gained renewed attention. Local journalists revisited the story, and true crime writers began piecing together timelines from old police reports. In 2010, the Washington Post published a long feature reminding readers of the victims, their names, their faces, and the fact that no one had ever been held accountable. The article triggered a wave of outrage and grief. For many Washington residents, it was the first time they'd ever heard about the murders. The DC Police Department set up a dedicated cold case unit to re-examine the evidence. Investigators compared the killings to other unsolved cases nationwide, looking for similar signatures. But each promising lead hit the same wall: lack of evidence, degraded samples, or the simple passing of time. Over the decades, theories have flourished. Some credible, others impossible to prove. One suggests that the Phantom might have been a former police officer or military veteran based on the precision of his actions and his ability to move unnoticed through multiple jurisdictions. Another theory holds that the murders were the work of more than one person, possibly a pair of offenders working together. That idea stems from the subtle differences in victims' conditions and the single use of a knife in one of the cases. But without DNA, fingerprints, or confessions, those theories remain just that. Today, more than 50 years after the first murder, the name Freeway Phantom still sends a shiver through Washington's older residents. In schools, local history lessons mention the case alongside the city's struggles with segregation, poverty, and policing. For many, the Phantom isn't just a killer. It represents the systemic failure of a city that didn't protect its children and didn't fight hard enough to bring their killer to justice. In 2021, the Metropolitan Police reaffirmed the case remains open. The statement from their cold case unit read, "We continue to review all forensic evidence as technology evolves. The victims of the Freeway Phantom have not been forgotten." Their words of small comfort to families who have waited half a lifetime for answers. As traffic still roars down the same highways, Route 50, Interstate 295 and Baltimore-Washington Parkway, drivers pass the same overpasses and wooded embankments where those girls were left so long ago. Most have no idea what happened there. To this day, no one knows who the Freeway Phantom was. He left behind no fingerprints, no credible witnesses, and no motive. Just 6 young victims, their lives taken, and a trail of fear that never truly faded. And for the families, the grief remains raw. For the city of Washington, the Phantom lingers, a ghost on the highway, forever unseen, forever unpunished. Crime at Bedtime is a Mashed Pumpkin production. Created, hosted and produced by Jack Lawrence. Audio and sound design by Jack Lawrence of Mashed Pumpkin Productions and Dom Evans and James Costa of Earsay.